In the spring of 1901, in the copper camp of Bisbee, high in the Mule Mountains of southern Arizona, a timberman named Elias Penrose went down a shaft that the Copper Queen Company would seal within 7 days. He was a Cornish-born man in his middle 40s, a setter of timber and a reader of ground, the kind of worker a company trusted to feel a level beginning to move before it moved. He had worked the oxidized copper of the district for the better part of 15 years. He knew the warm carbonate dust and the green stain the ore left on every glove and collar, and he knew the particular hush of rock that has water somewhere behind it. On the morning the deeper level was opened, he was among the first men sent down. By the end of that week, the working was capped. The crew was scattered across the other shafts of the camp, and the company record for that ground shows a closure so ordinary that no one reading it would pause. Water, it says, and rock that would not pay. What Penrose brought up with him is not in that record. It survives in fragments, in an account he gave near the end of his life to a parish priest in a mining town 2 states away, and it exists at all only because the man who heard it set part of it down on paper before he too was gone. If this record has your attention, hit the like button and subscribe, and leave a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. It matters to know who is paying attention to this. To understand what was sealed, the ground itself has to be understood, because the ground under Bisbee is not ordinary ground. The Mule Mountains are limestone, and limestone is a stone that water remembers. For millions of years before any company sank a shaft into them, rainwater carried its faint acid down through the cracks of that limestone and ate the rock away from the inside, hollowing the mountain into a honeycomb of voids, some no wider than a man's fist, some larger than a chapel. Into those hollows, across the same long stretch of time, copper-bearing waters crept and cooled and hardened into ore, and they left the district a wealth that drew men out of half the working world. The deep blue of azurite, the green of malachite, banded like the rings cut through a tree. The red oxide and the soft native copper a man could shave with the edge of a knife. The best specimens that came out of the Bisbee ground were so fine they would end their lives in glass cases in museums on the far coasts, and the metal that came out of it by the ton helped wire a country that was learning to run on electric current. The voids ran back into the rock farther than any lamp would show, and the lowest of them, the ones that lay beneath the level where the standing groundwater began, were not empty at all, but brimful and still, sealed pools that had waited in the dark since before there were men anywhere to wonder at them. The men who came to mine all of it were following the copper down into a mountain that was already full of openings. That is the first thing the ordinary account leaves flat. Bisbee was never a matter of cutting clean tunnels through solid stone. It was a matter of working through ground that nature had opened long before and then refilled, and now and then a crew cutting forward through the rock would break out of it and into a space that something other than men had made. The men who did that cutting were, more than any other kind, Cornishmen. The hard rock mines of Cornwall had been dying through the second half of the 1800s. The tin and the copper there worked out or undersold, and the men who knew that trade better than anyone alive had scattered across the world to practice it wherever there was ore in stone. They went to Australia and to South Africa and to the mountain camps of the American West, and the other miners called them Cousin Jacks, because every one of them, asked if he knew a good man for an open place, had a cousin named Jack back home who could do the work. They brought their skill with them, the feel for a drill, and the knowledge of how a face should be cut, and they brought their pasties wrapped in cloth for the dinner pail, and their chapel hymns for the Sunday. In Bisbee, they filled the boarding houses that climbed the steep sides of Tombstone Canyon and crowded along Brewery Gulch, and they went down the Copper Queen shaft 6 days in the week. The work was hard, and it was dangerous in ways the surface above never saw. Men were crushed under loosened rock, and killed in falls down the shafts, and sickened by the bad air that gathered at the ends of dead workings, and the company hospital up the canyon took in a steady traffic of the broken and the dying, and the count of them was kept in the company's own ledgers in the company's own way. A miner learned not to ask too much about the men who failed to come up. He learned the shape of his own shift and the ground he was set to cut, and very little beyond it, because very little beyond it was ever offered to him. Elias Penrose was one of them, ordinary among hundreds like him, and nothing in his life marked him out until the morning he was sent to judge a piece of ground that the company decided no one should ever see again. The company that owned that ground, and most of the ground around it, was the Copper Queen Consolidated Mining Company, the Bisbee arm of Phelps Dodge. The firm had begun far away and in another trade, a New York metals and import house, and it had moved into copper as the country's hunger for the metal grew, until it became one of the great copper powers in the land. Its chief mining man in the district was the engineer James Douglas, a careful and intelligent figure who had built the company's fortune on knowing exactly what a piece of ground was worth and exactly what it would cost to take the metal out of it. Under his hand, the Copper Queen had grown into the engine of the whole camp, and by the turn of the century the company did not simply employ Bisbee. It was Bisbee. It owned the largest store, the company mercantile that sold the miners their boots and their flour and their black powder on credit against the next pay. A man could be born in a company house, doctored in a company bed, and buried out of a company account, and never once in his working life hold a dollar that had not passed first through the company's hand and come back to it again. The newspaper printed what the company judged fit to print. The bank lent on the terms the company set. There was no second power in the camp to appeal to, no rival authority a worried man might carry a hard question to, because every door in Bisbee opened, in the end, onto the same office. It held the paper on much of the housing. It had its hand in the bank and the newspaper and the hospital where injured men were carried and where the company surgeon wrote down what their injuries had been. When a man took work with the Copper Queen, he stepped into a world the company had built on every side of him, and the record that world produced was a record the company kept. This is the thing to hold on to for what follows, because the only account of 1901 that does not pass through the company's hands is the account of a dying man, and the only reason it survives is that he gave it far away, to someone who owed the company nothing and wanted nothing from it. The record that lets us reconstruct Elias Penrose at all is thin, and it should be called thin plainly, because a film that pretended to more than it had would be lying to you. There is a name on a shift roster. There is an entry in the company store ledger for goods bought on credit, the small debts of an ordinary working life. There is a line in a parish register, years later and far to the east, recording his death. From these scraps, and from the priest's account, a figure can be drawn, and the figure is an ordinary one. A skilled man, sober by the standards of a camp where sobriety was rare, trusted with the timbering of new ground because timber was the one thing that stood between a working that held and a working that came down on the men inside it. Setting timber in bad ground was its own craft, the fitting of squared sets one against the next, so the weight of the mountain was carried and passed and held, and a good timberman was worth more to a company than a fast driller, because a fast driller only made ore, and a good timberman kept the men who made it alive. Penrose was that kind of man. It is part of why he was sent out first along the edge of the new opening, and part of why what he said about it, at the very end of his life, is worth setting beside the company's clean and silent books. In the early months of 1901, the Copper Queen was pushing one of its shafts deeper, chasing the sulfide ore that lay below the oxidized copper near the surface. The shallow ore in the district, the azurite and malachite, and the rest of it, sat in the zone where air and water had worked on the original metal for ages, and changed it. Below that zone lay the darker sulfides, the ore the company wanted in quantity, and the only way to it was down. The deeper a Bisbee working went, the more water it met, because the deeper levels ran below the natural water table of the mountain, and below that line the same limestone that had been hollowed out for ages was hollowed and flooded both. Holding that water back was the great running cost of the whole district. Pumps ran day and night at the bottoms of the shafts, lifting water up the levels and out, and a working that made more water than it made money was a working a company would give up without sentiment. The fight against the water was the unending labor of the deep camp, a thing that never finished and never could, because the mountain held more water than any pump would ever lift, and the only victory on offer was to stay a little ahead of it from one shift to the next. The engineers spoke of the water table the way sailors speak of the sea, as a thing with a level of its own that did not care in the least what men wanted from it, and they knew that to cut below that level was to ask the water in and then to spend forever keeping it out. On paper, that is exactly what 1901 became. The deeper level was opened, the level met water, the level was closed. Read alone, the company's own record is complete and shut and entirely believable. It is only when that record is set beside the account Penrose gave that a gap opens, and the gap is not in what the company wrote down. It is in what the company never gave itself time to write. The thing that does not fit the ordinary story is the speed. Mines met water all the time. The usual answer to water was never to seal a shaft inside a week. The usual answer was to bring in larger pumps, to drive a drainage level toward the trouble, to set the cost of the water against the value of the ore, and make a slow commercial decision over a season or more. Closing a working in 7 days was not a calculation made on paper at a desk. It was an order carried out at a run. The men were taken off the level and sent to other shafts with their pay made up the same week, which a company did not do unless it wanted them scattered and busy and not standing together at one headframe with time to talk. The cage that had carried the crew down the deeper level was put back to ordinary service on the upper workings, as though that lower ground had never been opened, and the mouth of the level was closed, not merely barred against trespass, but filled and capped, in a manner that meant no one was meant to go down it again. A company seals a worked-out level loosely, with a gate and a painted warning, because worked-out ground is only dangerous to a fool. A company that seals a level the way this one was sealed is shutting a door it does not want opened. It is the manner of the closing, more than anything a dying man ever said, that first tells a careful eye the ordinary account is missing something. What the account adds is what the level held. By the priest's record of what Penrose told him, the deeper level did meet water, but it met the water by breaking into it. The crew was cutting forward through limestone when the face began to change, when the rock ahead sounded hollow under the steel, and then the face gave way, and the men were standing at the lip of a cavern their lamps could not throw light across. This much in itself was not unheard of in Bisbee. The district was known for breaking into natural caves, and some of those caves were lined with crystal so fine that the pieces taken from them would later sit under museum glass. What stopped the crew cold was not that a cavern existed, it was the size of the thing, and the water at the bottom of it, and the cold. The far wall stood beyond the reach of the light entirely. The floor fell away below the lip into a pool that was black and flat, and gave back the lamp flame without a single ripple, as though the water had not moved in a very long time and did not intend to begin. The men threw stones out into the dark to find the far side of it, and heard nothing come back, no clatter against a distant floor, only the small flat sound of a stone meeting the water somewhere out beyond the reach of the light, and then the silence closing over it again. They could not say how wide the space ran, or how deep the pool lay beneath it. The light simply ended a few yards out, against nothing at all, the way a lamp ends at the edge of open night. And the air that rose out of the space was wrong. It was colder than the working around it, which made no sense for ground that deep, where the rock grows warmer the farther down a man goes. It carried a smell several of the men remembered for the rest of their lives, something mineral and old, not the sulphur of the ore and not the close rot of dead air, a smell none of them had a steady name for. Penrose, by the account, was the man sent out along the lip with a lamp lashed to a pole to judge whether the ground could be timbered at all, because timbering was his trade. What he saw out there, on the edge of the company's new wealth, is the thing the record does not contain. A careful line has to be drawn here, because this is the exact point where a story of this kind can stop being history and start being invention, and the difference is the whole of its worth. What can be said with confidence is what the district was, and what the company was, and how the closure was carried out, and those things are documented in the ordinary records of American mining and in the long memory of the camp itself. What the priest set down is a second-hand account of a dying man's memory of a single night more than 50 years behind him, and it has to be held as exactly that and nothing firmer. It is not proof, it is testimony, partial and late and human, But it is specific in the way that invented stories usually are not, and what it describes, when it is read closely, is not a monster and not a marvel, and nothing that breaks the natural order of the world. It describes plain evidence that the cavern had been entered by men before, long before any company existed to put a shaft down to it. If this investigation is still with you, subscribe and turn on notifications. There is more sealed down here than any single film can reach. Your attention is what makes it possible to keep pulling this back up. What Penrose described seeing, in the account as the priest preserved it, was worked stone. Not the raw crystal the Bisbee caves were famous for, but stone that human hands had cut and stacked. Along one side of the cavern, above the line of the still water, his lamp found what he took at first for a natural ledge, and then understood was nothing of the kind. A low course of fitted blocks running back into the dark, the sort of dry stonework a man builds without mortar, by choosing each stone to sit true against the last. There were timbers, or what had once been timbers, gone soft and black with age, but holding still the squared shape that no fall of rock ever gives to wood. He put his hand to one of the blocks of the low wall, and found it cold and slick and certain under his palm, set there by someone, fitted with care by someone, in a place the company's own maps swore no one had ever been. He counted, without meaning to count, the courses of the stone, and there were more of them than a single afternoon's work, more than a handful of men could have raised in a season. Whoever had built it had meant it to last, and it had. And on the wall above the old work there were marks, scratched and scored lines, that he could not read and did not try to read, the leavings of hands that had been in that space long before the camp, before the company, before the territory, had a name on any map the company would have recognized. He did not stay out on the lip long. He came back along the pole and told the shift boss what was there, and within the week the level was gone, capped and filled, and Elias Penrose never went down that shaft again. None of what he described, set on its own, breaks the known history of the region, and that has to be said as plainly as the rest. Arizona ground had been worked for copper and for color long before the Copper Queen put its first shaft down. The native peoples of the Southwest had mined azurite and malachite for the blue and the green of their paint for centuries before any European set foot in those mountains. Spanish prospectors and the Mexican miners who came after them had followed the copper through that country generations before the American firms arrived, and many an American claim was nothing more than an old working found again and filed under a new name. Spanish tools were turned up in more than one Arizona mine, old iron gone to rust, the marks of picks no living company had ever swung, and the men who found such things were rarely surprised by them, because the ground had a long memory and the Americans were only its latest tenants. What Penrose described may have been older and stranger than any Spanish working, the wall cruder, and the marks on the rock above it past reading, but it sat within the same plain truth. Men had been in those mountains, and under them, for a very long time before the Copper Queen arrived to call the copper its own. A cut wall and rotted timber deep in the Mule Mountains are not, in themselves, an impossibility. Across most of the mining West, they were the ordinary truth rather than the exception, the sign that someone had simply been there first. So the question that matters is not whether what Penrose saw was something beyond nature, because nothing in the honest account asks it to be. The question is why the Copper Queen, on meeting plain evidence that the ground was older and stranger than its own claim allowed, chose not to study it, not to log it, not to send a single engineer down to measure and describe it, but to close it inside a week and scatter the men who had stood at its edge. The answer the account points toward is not mystery at all. It is liability and water and the cold arithmetic of a company that knew precisely what it was doing. Consider first what the company stood to lose to the water alone. A working that had broken into a flooded cavern of that size was not a working that could be cheaply timbered and mined out. It was a working that threatened every level around it, because the water behind that black pool would find the lower workings if it ever found a path, and in limestone groundwater always, in the end, finds a path. To timber such a cavern, to pump it down, to make it safe enough to take ore from, would have cost more than the ore inside it could ever have returned, and James Douglas was exactly the kind of engineer who could run that sum in an afternoon and reach the bottom of it without regret. On the water alone, a hard man would have walked away. But the water alone explains a slow abandonment, a barred gate, a working written off across a season and forgotten. It does not by itself explain the speed and the silence. For that, the old stonework matters, and it matters not because it was wondrous, but because it was inconvenient. A find of older workings could cloud a company's title to its ground. It could draw the eye of the territorial authorities, of rival claimants who might argue the claim had not been the company's to take, of the kind of outside inspection that a firm running a closed company town did not welcome onto its property. And there was the plainer trouble of the men themselves. A camp ran on its crews staying steady and going down the shafts without hesitation, and nothing emptied a working faster than a story passing through the boarding houses that something had been found below that the men were not meant to see. The Copper Queen had every reason to want that level shut, before the tale of it could spread through Brewery Gulch and become the kind of thing that stopped a man at the collar of the shaft and would not let him step into the cage. Seal it fast, make up the pay of the few who had seen it, send them apart to other ground, and let the written record say water and poor rock, which was true as far as it reached and left out only the part that mattered. There is nothing in that course of action that requires the strange or the supernatural. It requires only a company that valued its control of a copper town above the truth of a single night, and there is no need to imagine the Copper Queen capable of such a thing, because the same interest proved itself capable of far worse, in the open, in front of the whole country, only 16 years later. In the summer of 1917, when the miners of Bisbee organized and struck for better pay and safer ground, the Phelps Dodge interest did not sit down to bargain. It saw a sheriff deputize a posse of nearly 2,000 men, armed them, and at dawn those men went house to house and shaft to shaft and took some 1,200 striking workers at gunpoint. They marched them through the streets of the camp to a railroad siding, loaded them into boxcars that had lately carried cattle and still held the filth of it, and hauled them more than 100 miles to the east, out across the line into the New Mexico desert, where they were put off the train and left in the heat with little food and less water, and told they were not to come back. The Bisbee deportation is not a rumor and not a reconstruction and not the work of any film straining for an effect. It is one of the most thoroughly recorded acts of corporate force in the whole history of American labor, set down in federal inquiry and in the testimony of the men who were carried off, and in the end, the law found no one to punish for it. The men who had been carried off were held out in the desert and warned against return, and many of them never did come back, and those who tried found the roads into the camp watched and themselves no longer welcome on ground they had worked for years. The whole of it had been done in a single morning, with the calm of a thing long prepared, by men who believed the camp was theirs to empty and refill as they saw fit. No court undid it. No officer of the company suffered for it. It stood, and it stands in the record still, as plain and as documented as an act of that size can be. It tells you with total clarity what that company was prepared to do to people who became inconvenient to its hold on the ground. An interest that would deport 1,200 living men into the desert to keep its grip on a copper town would not lose a minute's sleep over capping a flooded level and reassigning the handful of men who had looked into it. Set beside 1917, the sealing of 1901 is a small and ordinary thing, exactly the kind of thing such a company did as a matter of course, and left no honest line about in its books. What became of Elias Penrose after that week is the part the record very nearly loses for good. He did not stay long in Bisbee. The store ledger shows his account closed out within the year, and the shift rosters stopped carrying his name. By the little that can be traced he drifted, the way mining men drifted, to other camps in other states, working ground that held no caverns and asked no hard questions, and he did not speak of what he had seen, or if he did, no one near him judged it worth the keeping. He grew old as such men grew old, his lungs going hard with the rock dust that killed so many of his trade, the fine grit of a working lifetime settling at last into the chest. It is only in his final illness, an old man by then and far from Arizona, that the account comes to the surface at all. And it comes to the surface because of the choice he made about whom to tell. He did not give it to a company man, and he did not give it to a newspaper that might have made a sensation of it and lost it that way. He gave it to a priest, in the privacy a dying man is owed, in a town 2 states distant from the Mule Mountains, to someone who held no stake in the Copper Queen and stood to gain nothing whether the old man spoke or kept his silence. What the priest wrote down was not a deathbed marvel served up for wonder. It was a man trying, at the very end, to set down a thing he had carried for half a century and never once been able to say aloud, the memory of a cold black cavern and a wall built by older hands, and a level closed so fast that he had understood, even as a young man standing at the collar with his pay in his pocket, that he had been made to forget something on purpose. He had kept the silence the company wanted of him all his life, because silence was the safe thing, and a working man learned early which questions were not his to ask. But a man at the end of his life has nothing left for the company to take from him, no pay to dock and no place to send him, and the thing he could not say at the collar of the shaft, he could say at last in a quiet room, to a priest, with the door shut and the years behind him, and nothing more in the world to lose. The priest's note of it is brief, and it was never published in his lifetime. It survived the way such things survive, folded into private papers, passed down without ceremony by people who half forgot what they were keeping, surfacing later among the records of a parish that no longer holds services. It proves nothing beyond itself. It is one man's account, written down by another, of a night the company that owned the ground had made certain would leave no other mark. That, in the end, is the whole shape of the thing. There is no archive code to point you to, no neat document number, because the company that might have produced one had every reason in the world not to, and any film that handed you a tidy reference for a matter like this would be inventing it to seem sure. What there is instead is an absence with a clean and deliberate edge, the production record for that ground that simply stops, the level that was capped with a care no worked-out ground has ever needed. The crew broken up and sent apart inside a single week, their pay made good early. The one account that got out, and got out only because it was given to a man beyond the company's reach by someone who knew his own time was nearly done. The distance between what the record states and what the record will not hold is not filled by invention. It is filled by the documented character of the company that did the sealing, the same interest that would later empty a town into the desert, and by the single human voice that lasted long enough to say the ground had been entered before, and shut in haste, and written off as nothing. What remains today is less than a person might hope, and more than the company ever meant to leave. The Copper Queen ground is still there under Bisbee, though much of it was long since torn open from above, swallowed in the decades after, by the great pit the company cut into the side of the mountain, when underground work gave way to the cheaper violence of the open cut. The pit grew across the middle years of the century, until it had eaten whole streets and whole districts of the old camp, and the waste rock hauled out of it was piled into long ridges that changed the shape of the land for good. Where the deep shafts had once dropped away into the dark, the daylight now falls straight onto a terraced wound a person can see clear across from the far rim, the mountain turned inside out and its hollows carried off in ore cars. The deeper levels of 1901 lie somewhere below or within that enormous removal, their exact mouth lost now in the company's own later digging, and the cavern, if it stands at all, stands sealed and flooded, and beyond any easy reach, in ground no firm has a commercial reason to open again. The town above it has become a gentler place than it was, a settlement of galleries and old hotels and tours that carry visitors a little way into the safer workings to feel the cool of the rock and the press of the dark on every side. The deep record of the district sits in archives, a great part of it the company's own, written in the company's own hand, full and shut and silent, in exactly the places where a Cornish timberman once stood with a lamp on a pole and saw a wall that should not have been there. The priest's note survives, somewhere, in the keeping of people who never knew the mountain it described. And the question Elias Penrose carried to a stranger at the end of his life stays where he left it, under the limestone, behind the cap, in the cold space the water has held without a ripple for more than 100 years. The company called it water and poor rock. The man who saw it called it something else, once, to one person, before the dark took the rest. The record keeps them both now, set side by side, and lets the distance between them stand. Thank you for staying with this until the end. If what you heard here stayed with you, the other films on your screen continue the record. Subscribe if you haven't, and I will see you in the next one.